Seconded. All right, everyone, thank you so much for coming. I can see people are just popping up on screen. We'll just take another moment as people are logging in. All right, so just to get the program going, making sure that we end at a good time, I'm going to get started. People can log in. We have a couple set of introductions and everyone can log on in. All right, so good evening, everyone. A warm welcome from the Berkeley Public Library. Thank you so much for logging in tonight and attending our author interview with Libby Copeland. She will be discussing her new book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, which discusses the incredible impact of home DNA testing. It's a great book. I read it in 3 days. I was absolutely hooked. It tells some very suspenseful stories. There's a lot of interesting science facts. And our Berkeley Public Library Book Club had a very spirited discussion about the many ethical issues that the book delves into. So tonight's event is being run by leaders of the Berkeley Public Library's regular science program, Popping the Science Bubble. This monthly program happens on the evening of the third Tuesday of every month, and during it, 2 UC Berkeley grad or postdoc students discuss their research. The program is run by graduate students Oksana Andrik, Jenna Tan, and Madison Lehmer. Madison, a graduate student in molecular and cell biology, will be interviewing our author this evening. Please save audience questions for the end of our event and type them into the chat box. We would also like to thank the Oakland Public Library, Alameda County Library, Tamaha County Library, Wonderfest, and Friends of the Berkeley Public Library for publicizing and supporting this program. I will now hand over the program to Jenna Tan, who will introduce our author.
Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist, author, and self-proclaimed cultural spelunker who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for media outlets such as The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, published by Abrams in 2020, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. So if you haven't read this book yet or need more reasons to recommend it to others, just know that it was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that file, read this book." The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. And the Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? And so with those questions in mind, let's welcome Libby and Madison.
Yeah, hi, Libby. Thanks for being here. We're excited to have you.
Thank you so much. This is so cool. So thank you for having me. I'm really psyched to be here.
Yeah, I think, that Washington Post review really, I think, sums up why we all kind of sink our teeth into your book, right? We're all interested about what makes us who we are and struggling to define that, whether it's when we learn something new about our heritage or honestly, when we just learn about a new hobby. What makes us us and where's that coming from? And I think your book, really gets into all the different facets of those questions in really interesting and insightful ways. And so I think that kind of gets to what piques most everyone's interest, at least a little bit, in this subject. But what particularly drew you to this? How did you come to write The Lost Family?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in, stories of ordinary people who find themselves in really unusual and extraordinary circumstances. And, kind of intimate stories, right? Stories about like human motivation, what makes us who we are, how do we craft our identities. And then about 4 years ago, I was in conversation with one of my editors at the Washington Post, and we were talking about home DNA testing, which at the time was not nearly as big as it is now, but it was really starting to grow with a lot of advertising and growing public awareness. And it struck me that it's kind of the perfect way of talking about these questions having to do with construction of identity, because there's a lot of people who turn to DNA testing to discover themselves, right? They're looking to anchor themselves. They're trying to anchor themselves in time and through history and through their forebears. And then there's a significant subset of people who are finding out that they're not who they thought. Either their ancestral roots are different, or their genetic origins are different. There's something about the construction of their family that's not what they understood. It has incredible implications for their kind of intimate relationships with their parents, for instance. And so we were interested in looking at, kind of the unexpected consequences of a technology that was being billed as marketing, as entertainment. It was really cheap, it was really fast, it was really easy. What happens when you find out you're not who you thought, right? On an essential level, on an existential level. And so I wrote a story for the Washington Post that was just this kind of long, fascinating tale, one person's story. And then I got this kind of outpouring of email from hundreds of readers across the country and actually abroad as well. And they were saying, like, that was a really compelling story. I want to share the story of what happened to me when I took a DNA test 3 months ago, 3 years ago, 6 years ago, right? And these stories were incredible. It was people kind of spelunking, to use that word, around in their own past and uncovering things they never would have found but for DNA, right? And it was causing them to consider these really profound questions about selfhood and about how we orient ourselves on this earth. And it was in those interactions, those phone calls, those emails that I thought, okay, this is like not the story of one small demographic. This is not the story of like, a handful of people. This is a true American phenomenon because Americans are taking to this technology like no other country. It is a seismic cultural change. I think it deserves to be a book.
I mean, that's definitely, I think your book exemplifies that, yeah, there are tons of stories out there, and there are, every one of them is singular and interesting and different and seems to have a pretty profound impact on the person carrying it. And it seems no two revelations with this technology are alike. But yeah, you talk about kind of all of these stories being within the past, 1 to 6 years, but this technology is, at home or personal DNA testing has been around for a couple decades, and I think has kind of generally climbed to being more and more powerful. And so has, genealogical personal studies. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about kind of the history of what this technology is even capable of now, where it started, kind of what we can learn from it, what can we do with it?
Yeah, so DNA testing as it exists now is not how it started. It started 21 years ago. In fact, the very first company in the US to send out home DNA test kits to discover your family history sent them out in April of 2000. So we are literally on the 21st anniversary, like this month. And that kind of home DNA testing that was being offered back then was so different. It was a different kind of analysis, a different kind of DNA that was being studied. And the results that people were getting were, relative to what you can discover now, much less informative and more crude. And the tests were also more expensive. So it wasn't like a widespread thing of widespread interest. It was like a truly niche product meant for genealogical hobbyists who are willing to spend the money. And then about 10 years ago, something called autosomal DNA testing came on the scene. And what autosomal DNA testing can do is it can give you two key pieces of information. It can identify relatives along your maternal and paternal sides, and that's people who the database shows up as matching to you as a genetic relative because you and they share overlapping genetic segments. And those are people who are customers for the same company. So, a first cousin, a second cousin, something like that, if they happen to have tested the same company, they're going to show up as related to you. And the other key piece of information that the companies are giving you, which is more of a kind of an educated guess, it's not as reliable, is something called your ethnicity estimate, which attempts to tell you where in the world your people come from along your various branches, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And that, that varies from company to company because it is truly an estimate. It's not as reliable, it's not robust in the way that the relative prediction, the relative matching is. So, when I started writing about the phenomenon for the Washington Post 4 years ago, there were 8 million DNA test kits sold. And today there are at least 37 million. The vast majority of those have sold in the United States. And something on the order of 15% of the US adult population has taken one. So we are truly saturated at this point to a degree that we weren't before. And the marketing has really kind of framed this as, acts of self-discovery, usually described in kind of, satisfy your curiosity, bring your family closer, find out if you really might have a hidden talent for baking biscotti because it turns out you're Italian, right? And there's some unfortunate kind of ethnic tropes that we can talk about, but it's a light thing, right? It's a kind of, the assumption is that any discoveries you make are going to be coming with a certain amount of psychological and emotional and historical remove. And that is not the case for a lot of people because, of course, when we discover something different about our own genetic origins, our own families, or even our roots, it may deeply impact our kind of sense of selves, our present day identities. And so that's sort of like where the kind of landscape is and the popularity is, and also the unexpected journey is also are arising.
Yeah. Did you find, when doing these interviews that most people found more than they bargained for? Or, is it more common that people are going in and, maybe finding out they have a slightly different country of origin, but overall it's not, rocking their world?
So the majority of people are getting, results that are in line with what they expected. And that could be really meaningful. Like in my family, we were able to discover relatives we didn't know about. And again, I can, kind of circle back to that, but like, that's like a really meaningful thing, but it wasn't disruptive to any family narratives. And then there's this kind of subset of people, and I've tried to quantify it. It's certainly more than 1 million consumers of the technology themselves who've discovered something significant that's not what they thought. So for instance, they're discovering that they are not genetically related to their father, which is a phenomenon known as NPE, which stands for non-paternity event or not parent expected. They might be discovering they have a previously unknown sibling or half sibling, maybe much older from a relationship one of their parents had before they were married or, outside the marriage. They might be discovering that they're donor conceived or adopted and not told for reasons having to do with cultural stigmas that existed when they came into the world. Or they might be discovering, something about their forebears, their grandparents, for instance, who, had a genetic ancestry that they hid from their descendants because they were trying to escape from discrimination, or they were assimilating the way out of those identities. And now we're in this era of cheap and easy DNA testing, and people can make that discovery very quickly in a way that their grandparents never could have imagined. So you have all these kind of scenarios, and that, those each one of those scenarios is something that has a ripple effect across many, many people. So for each one of those million consumers, there's often, say, 8 to 10 people within a family who are impacted. So you're really talking about millions of Americans right now who are having their worlds rocked by the revelations that come in these tubes.
That's, I mean, I guess a lot more than I would assume. But yeah, that's seems like, I mean, and I think also gets to this point, right? You put in your DNA and you ask your questions, but someone else's DNA is your answer, and what, you know, what they expected to get out of this repository might be different than what you expect or what either of you find. Does it seem that often these people kind of match up in their expectations, or people are, you know, maybe seeking, one person is seeking more than the other?
Yeah, so like that's actually one of the things that I was most interested in kind of tracing and articulating and telling stories about in The Lost Family, which is, you know, this question of the mismatch sometimes between my expectations and yours. And I should back up and say that you don't need to be in a DNA database to be identified. That's a really important point that we should, you know, establish. And there are so many people who have taken a DNA test now in the United States that we've achieved a tipping point. And the implications of the tipping point are that the vast majority of Americans are impacted by this technology and potentially are going to discover something about their own health or their own families that they didn't know, because somebody who shares genetic material with them is in the database. And the power of the shared DNA means that if, for instance, I don't know the identity of my genetic father, right? I've been looking for 10 years. I hired a private investigator before the DNA age came along. I am looking and looking. I can take a DNA test now, and I can figure out his identity even though he never tested. And I'm going to figure that out because I'm going to be able to match to a second cousin, maybe a third cousin or a few third cousins, maybe an aunt, and it'll be really easy. But these are techniques that people are using to kind of triangulate their understanding of their cousins. And from that triangulated data, those cousins who are in the database discover the identity of somebody who is not. So what that means is that very often somebody is figuring out the identity of a parent and reaching out to a parent who, again, maybe isn't and never even took a DNA test. And they're saying, hey, I think you're my genetic father. And that man is saying one of two things. That's a great blessing, and I'm really happy to know you. And maybe I didn't know that you existed. Or, you know, give me some time. Or who the heck are you? Or take a step back, right? And the reactions from fathers in this example, like run the gamut from men, like a man named Jeff, who I write about in the book, who embraces this daughter that he never knew existed, and sees her as a gift from God, to a man like the father of a woman named Linda, who sends her a discontinuance of contact letter through his attorney, saying, please stop contacting my client. He doesn't want to hear from you, dear biological daughter. And sort of like everything in between, right? There are families where people take some time and they're kind of able to accept their genetic kin, and there are families where that never happens. Sometimes because the reality of the existence of this person who's knocking on their email inbox saying, hi, I exist and I'm your long lost kin, kind of conflicts with the narratives of the family, sometimes very sacred stories about a family or understandings or beliefs of a parent. And then when those two truths collide, a lot of times existing families will kind of choose the truth that they've lived with and that they're more comfortable with, and say to this stranger who's coming into their lives, you know, we don't want to know you, and maybe even we don't believe that you're related to us. So you see that playing out basically all over America right now. And it's incredibly painful. And unlike in the world of, you know, medical genetics testing, where there are genetic counselors and medical professionals and other kind of gatekeepers to kind of help people understand their results, in the home DNA testing world, for better and for worse. And you hear, you know, different accounts of whether it's for better or for worse. It depends on the situation. Many people find this to be very empowering, that they can finally take this knowledge into their own hands. But, you know, to go along with that empowerment is the fact that there is nobody to hold your hand. There's nobody to kind of mediate a family that after 60 years is having something come into their lives, a surprise of an old secret and a human being, right, who wants a connection. And there's nobody to kind of help those families through these moments.
Yeah, I mean, I know my own grandmother, when she was in her mid 40s, got dropped on her that, you know, her supposed father wasn't her father, and that, you know, rejection from the other side of the family to, you know, I want to know who you are because that's interesting to me, and them saying, well, we don't really want to know who you are because that kind of disrupts us. Definitely, I think, you know, was a difficult time for her, and we've had to figure out whether we, you know, that's information that we ever kind of want to know again. But I think it's really interesting that there are these people on that other side that we never know or never knew and never thought we would know and never really cared to know. But once we hear that they're genetically related, we're oddly intrigued. And so I don't know, I guess I was wondering kind of what you found about, you know, why people are so interested in others that are just connected based on genetics. Maybe you've never known them, maybe you meet them as an adult and you finally, you know, you're genetically my brother and now we're kin regardless of not having known each other for more than a month. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to why, you know, that seems to be such the prevalent outlook.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question because it goes to the heart of one of the themes that I think comes up a lot in these discoveries, which is, you know, what is family? And obviously, family is not just biology. And in many cases, you know, family is you know, what we choose, and biology is just that, right? No more and no less. But for a lot of people who are making this discovery, biology is deeply meaningful, even if they don't necessarily think of it in the same category as the family that raised them. So for instance, and you know, this is almost a failure of language. You know, you can have a place in your heart for the man who contributed half your genetic material, even if the man you consider dad, who's, you know, is not related to you, is the one who to whom you owe most of your loyalty and love, and, you know, who tucked you in at night, sang you songs, and, you know, did the job. You know, the fact that you have a dad who adores you and who you adore doesn't mean that you can't also want to know about this other person. And I'm thinking in particular of a woman named Lori Pratt, who told me her story. Her story's in the book. You know, she discovered through DNA testing that she wasn't genetically related to her dad. She finally, after years of research, was able to figure out, you know, piece together the identity of her genetic father by using genetic genealogy techniques. And when she reached out to him, he cut off contact. He deleted his kit. He was like, you know, he was in his 80s. He was deeply religious. She told me that she felt that the revelation that she existed kind of jarred his sense of identity, right? He saw himself as a good man, as a man of conscience, and the guilt of knowing that he'd had a daughter that he did not know about and had not been able to provide for seemed to be really painful for him. And he you know, walked away from it. But Lori kept researching her genetic roots on her father's side. Now, some people might say, why? You know, the man doesn't want to have a relationship with you. Why bother to get to know his cousins, research the family, and figure out, you know, where you came from on that side? And the answer is from Lori that those roots are my roots too. You know, she wanted to know about the stories of that family. She wanted to see her own face and the face of her children in the face of her biological kin. And she was never able to have a relationship with him, but she was able to understand her roots and have relationships with other relatives. And ultimately, she legally changed her surname and took her biological father's surname because she said, that is the reality. That is the genetic reality of what I am, you know, regardless of whether he wants to have a relationship with me. I'm not doing this to make him mad. But, you know, she said, I just want to deal with reality. So, I mean, that is kind of a great illustration of a person who, you know, feels she owes a lot to her genetic roots, even as she told me, like, the man who raised me is my dad. I could never call anyone else dad. You know, and she waited until he had passed away to even, you know, seriously, you know, put herself into the research and, you know, contact her genetic father, because out of a sense of respect for her dad. She never told her dad. She didn't see that anything could be served by it. So people, you know, we can contain these seeming contradictions, and a lot more of us are needing to contain them now.
Yeah, I think that was kind of one of the stories that I think I found personally most interesting, primarily because it was very much separated an understanding of personal identity with any connection to one other person, just kind of being able to see yourself in other people and generally kind of where you fit in, either within your family or just a community that they all hold. Um, and it seems kind of that while there might be barriers, you know, now with people not wanting to talk to you, those are breaking down further and further and further as more people enter this, you know, their genetic data into this system. And it seems like we're kind of hitting a point where, regardless of whether you want to know your genetic family or you want to hide you know, genetic realities from your kids, you know, maybe you don't get to do that anymore and you don't get to hold that secret. Do you think this will generally lead to more kind of transparency within the family unit, or is it just going to be a bit more fraught of you don't know until you're 18, but once you're old enough, you learn?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And as you were saying that, I was flashing back to this bioethicist I interviewed who told me, when it comes to home DNA testing, you don't get to opt out, right? He said that to me a few years ago when the databases were smaller. It's even more true now. You're absolutely right. I mean, you know, it's increasingly not a choice, right? Because you can find out information about yourself, your family, or your health without even having tested. It means that everyone has to consider these questions, and for practical reasons, and also I think, for more moving and evocative human reasons, which have to do with these questions around, genetics and, the push-pull between biology and experience, and which things we honor when it comes to what we consider family and ethnicity. I think those are questions that are like, they're age old. You know, you can find evidence of, people in ancient Rome mulling these questions of what makes a family. And so, you know, I think that these are important questions to consider, you know, even if you've never taken a DNA test, both because it may impact you in a practical way, and because I think these are just, you know, really important to our kind of our humanity and our understanding of our human condition. To answer your question more directly, I do think that we have to be moving towards an era of greater intergenerational transparency. And sometimes, you know, I get asked in talks like, you know, what advice do you have for people who are about to take a DNA test? And I will often say, actually, my advice is not for those people. My advice is for people who are in possession of knowledge about their children's genetic origins that their children don't know. And that's because increasingly you don't have control over whether that comes out. And so if you know something about your child, right? Let's say your child was born by, donor conception 50 years ago, at a time when everyone, doctors, psychologists, lawyers, were saying, don't tell your child they're donor conceived, they'll do better. And there's all these psychological and legal, and social reasons not to tell them, right? And there was a stigma about it and people didn't tell. Very understandable. That being said, we are now in 2021. And your child may find out that in news because they take a test, because a child of theirs takes a test. And it is incumbent upon you to be able, if possible, to number one, control that narrative. Number two, answer the questions that your child's going to have. And number three, be knowledgeable about the fact that the child is going to appreciate getting that information directly from you much more so than they are going to be getting it from like a relative or, like a computer screen. So, so I do think, I think this is like a really painful time. It's like this is the era of genetic reckoning, right? That we're moving through. And what I've tried to do in my research is kind of document that painful time and when it leads to wonderful reconciliations and when it doesn't, right? And why some of the reasons are. And so I think this is an important era we're going to look back on, but I also think it has to change the way parents talk to their children. It has to change in terms of what they tell them about how they came into the world. And we're already halfway there because a lot of the stigmas that existed 50 years ago don't exist as greatly as they did. People are much more likely to tell their children that they're donor conceived if they're donor conceived, or that they're adopted if they're adopted. And we already have much less stigmas than we used to on things like single mothers. That's vastly changed. So we're kind of moving already in that direction, and I think DNA testing can't help but hasten that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like, over the course of searching in your book, the, answers come quicker, and the way that genealogy searching used to work was way more painstaking and you get way fewer answers. But it seems there's still, maybe if not on a, family connection gap, there's still maybe a less informed understanding of what our genetics means in terms of our ethnic origins, or potentially our larger communities, especially with certain groups, as you alluded to earlier, trying to escape persecution and hiding where they're from. Could you maybe talk to the kind of limitations of how we can figure out where we're from, but also kind of, what people are reckoning with in terms of, learning about a more lineage-based origin?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that genealogy can tell you, and then there are times when the paper records like just stop, right? And they tend to stop and you hit a brick wall, more so if you come from certain communities. So for instance, if you come from, if your ancestors were enslaved in this country and you are trying to research your enslaved ancestors, you're going to run right into what genealogists like to call a brick wall. If you try to follow your forebears through the federal census and you try to go back before 1870, because before 1870, people who were enslaved were not named. So how do you follow somebody's name when suddenly they disappear? And there are all other kinds of barriers for certain groups, including African Americans, obviously, but also other groups as well. Just as a general kind of principle, genealogical records tend to favor people who are in positions of power. They tend to be written about more. The records tend to be preserved more. They might be more likely to be literate and keeping, a diary or, notes on their family line, right? So what does DNA do? It can be kind of a leveling force, right? A force that kind of levels the field. And one of the things that I was like so excited to write and research and write about in The Lost Family was like how African American genealogists are using DNA, right? And putting it together with the paper records, because even when when the paper records are poor and there's not that many of them, you do really often almost always need to use the archives when they're there to augment the DNA understanding. And that has allowed some African American genealogists to understand where they came from before their ancestors were brought over in chains, but to a really granular degree, like understanding the precise community within the precise country, within the precise region where their ancestors came from, so that they could sketch out an entire kind of life of an ancestor, or to confirm oral narratives that were passed down within this country of, for instance, a great ancestor who was enslaved who, had a child by her white slave owner. Those kinds of stories get passed down, and DNA can then can prove them, can help us understand them, can contextualize them, and then sometimes match us up with cousins who might not know. And there are a lot of interesting stories about white cousins and Black cousins finding each other, and the kind of historical reckoning that can take place as a result of those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, that family history, right, carries a pretty heavy burden in how it was formed and who got where and who ended up kind of having the better end of the stick. But there also seems to be, with a heavy history, people who learn that they're from that, but never understood it growing up, or never really got to understand kind of the depths of how they came into being. And you discuss this with a few stories in your book, of people learning that they either come from lineages of people who were brought over as slaves, or facing other persecution elsewhere, and kind of reckoning with what it means to not have grown up in that culture, but still are shaped
Yeah.
by it. And what does it mean to them to kind of learn that they're a part of this later on?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I think, one of the amazing stories from the book is the story of Rosario. And he is a man who is in his early 50s by the time he makes his DNA discovery. He believes that he is Sicilian. And he believes this because that's what his mom tells him. And he clings to that identity because he's what I describe in the book as a seeker. He's somebody who really wants to define himself through his understanding of the past. And I think we are growing into a nation of seekers. The popularity of genealogy and DNA testing have never been as great as they are now. We happen to be in a moment where, as a nation, we are looking back and trying to understand, in a number of ways. And Rosario is a classic seeker. He, because he believes that he's Sicilian, he changes his name when he grows up to something Italian. He learns to sing opera. He converts to Catholicism. He proposes to his Italian-American girlfriend after flying her to Italy. So he is fully on the kind of, this identity. And then he starts doing genealogy and DNA testing. And what he discovers is that the Sicilian story is a fiction. What he discovers is that his mother is biracial. She's the product of a Black man and a white woman who had a relationship, had 2 children, were forcibly separated, and her father was actually put in jail. And that relationship and the dissolution of her family, and the subsequent discrimination that she faced as a biracial child growing up in a rural white community, meant that when she grew up and had children, she was bound and determined to protect them from having, to experience what she went through. So she told them that they were Sicilian. And so for Rosario to discover that, in fact, he's 18% sub-Saharan African, but reads like a white man, right? He looks like a white man. He's lived his life like a white man. He doesn't have to worry about catching a cab, as he puts it. He doesn't have to worry about being pulled over for driving while Black, right? So there's all these ways in which he doesn't have to experience the price that is, sometimes extracted from African Americans in this country. And he also doesn't have the beauty and the experiences. Like he's not gotten to live with all of that. So he starts to connect with his Black cousins, and he starts to kind of explore this idea of himself as a Black man. But, and I'm sure, in the year since my book has come out, probably he's evolved further. We keep in touch, but I haven't sort of asked him, kind of deep questions like this. But as I was writing the book, I would talk to him maybe like every 6 months and see him. He was constantly evolving, like everyone I interviewed. These stories don't end. They keep going because identity is a changing thing, and because processing these revelations is a big deal and can take a lot of time. But as he was coming into his discovery, he was also coming into his identity and starting to unravel and ask himself questions of like, to what extent can I be a Black man? How can I identify? Does it come off as false? That question of, are you your lived experience or are you your DNA, is a really fraught and complicated one, and one that a lot of the people in my book, kind of had to grapple with. And it's not the same answer for every person, and it can vary depending on the circumstances of discovery, the circumstances of why you didn't know. This, I'll just say one more thing, the central narrative of the book is about a family of 7 siblings who make a major discovery. And by the end of the book, each one of them has a different take on whether they claim that ethnicity. So that is the perfect example to me of the ways that different human beings can interpret the same facts.
And I think it really starts to break down this kind of debate as well about how much our genes actually mean in terms of our ethnic origin or racial identity personally, which on the science side has unfortunately kind of come to a lot of poor conclusions. We've had the history of eugenics. There have been a lot of attempts to divide people specifically based on, you genetically seem to be part of this culture, so you must also have these traits. And I think as we get more data, it helps break that narrative down a little bit more if we can point to people living a wide span of lives and having a lot of genetic overlap. But could you maybe speak more, right, to how this data and how we're connecting to it or not connecting to it is kind of breaking down our concepts of race and also how genetic plays a role?
Yeah, so you kind of see it going in 2 different directions at once. On the one hand, there's a lot of marketing around home DNA tests that's pretty problematic, that conflates ethnic tropes with DNA in a way that is absolutely unsupportable. And I'm thinking particular of an ad from one of these companies that they shows a figure skater on the ice, and it says, where did she get her incredible, capacity to skate like this? And a little pie chart pops up, and it says, is it her her British drive, her Scandinavian precision, or her, I think it's like South Asian grace? And it's so unbelievably ridiculous, right? Both in the kind of cliche of the tropes, and also in this idea that you somehow inherit this through your genes. So I worry about marketing like that, because the way that most Americans encounter anything having to do with DNA is frankly through home DNA testing at this point, right? Because most of us are not going to genetic counselors for advanced testing. And we might know a little bit from high school, right? But DNA testing with those pie charts that you get that tell you you're 27% XYZ, that is the main way we are encountering all of this. So the kind of question is, given that we are 99.5% genetically identical to every other human being on Earth, what happens when you take a DNA test? Does that reinforce your sense of racial essentialism, which is really problematic and wrongheaded? Or does it break down those divisions? Because when we see the diversity in ourselves, we start to realize how similar we are, right? And there's some evidence that that could happen, but we don't really know yet. So there's some research out of a sociologist named Wendy Roth, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's done some testing to see how people think about these issues before and after they take a home DNA test. And she had something like 800 subjects, and she got them all to take DNA tests. And what she found was that for people who go into the test with greater genetic literacy, so they have a little bit more idea of what DNA is and what it can tell you, right? When they stepped out of taking that test at the end of the process, they had a lesser sense of racial essentialism and a greater sense of our commonalities. They were less inclined to kind of think in fatalistic terms about the genes, which is always a problem with human beings. Like, we tend to think in these essentialist ways. And that's really promising. On the other hand, she found some evidence suggesting that when people went in with pretty low genetic literacy, they actually stepped out of the process with a greater sense of racial essentialism. So that is kind of an area for caution. But I do think, and I wrote about this recently in an op-ed for the New York Times, I do think that this moment is a great opportunity for us. Because I think that, for instance, if you look at people like Rosario, right? White people who test and they discover, actually, according to that old crazy one-drop rule, I would be considered Black. And there's a lot of Americans like that. 23andMe has actually done research showing how many Americans for whom that would be true. Once you sort of see that, and it forces you to kind of push back on those concepts, and also wrestle with the realities of our country's painful history involving race. And, stories of people who come together, I was mentioning earlier, but people like a white cousin and a Black cousin who are brought together because it turns out that, one of them is descended from a white enslaver and one of them is descended from, that white enslaver and the woman that he owned and had sex with, right? When those people come together through a genealogy database and start to unravel their shared past, the reality of America cannot be denied. And that reality is something that Americans really need to grapple with. And so that's why I say that I think home DNA testing can be an opportunity to really look at the hard facts of our past and then assess and really see where we are now.
Well, then it's got a lot of work to do, and it's got a lot of responsibility on its shoulders.
Yes.
And so, it seems like, there's a lot of power there. You talk about kind of 23andMe also doing this testing with our data and looking at these larger trends. When we put this data out there, we're kind of just asking questions about us, but how is that being used kind of by companies or potentially by people trying to get the data from these companies to, look for new things, or, study the kind of role of genetics in culture?
So when you take a test with a company, if they're a company that has these research relationships like 23andMe does, where they're trying to develop pharmaceuticals, and obviously, 23andMe is like a Bay Area company, and maybe a lot of people may know this, but they are on the verge of going public. They were recently announced that they're going to go public, and they're valued at a reported value of $3.5 billion. So that's not too shabby. And so there's a great presence of home DNA testing in the Bay Area, not just through 23andMe, but also through MyHeritage, which was recently purchased by a equity firm out there. So, they are particularly interested, 23andMe is particularly interested in health-related research. They really think that that is where the money in the future of home DNA testing is. What's grown their database up to now has been people who are curious to find out how XYZ they are, right? Mm-hmm. But there's some evidence that those people have kind of already been scooped up, that that's a limited market. They see the potential of developing pharmaceuticals as much, much greater. And when you sign up to have your DNA tested with them, even if you're just interested in finding out how XYZ you are, they'll give you the option to potentially, let your information be looked at in anonymized, aggregated form in the context of health-related research. And most people say yes. And that impulse comes from a kind of a sense of, I think, magnanimity, right? Like, it's like, if something in my genome can help someone else with some rare disease, like, go for it. That information should be protected. If 23andMe follows through on its, on its protocols and its, kind of chain, its protected chain, and, maintains its consent policies and all of that. But I think for some people, there's this anxiety about possibilities like insurance discrimination, genetic discrimination through insurance, right? Insured declining to insure you because they find out somehow that you're at hidden, risk of early onset Alzheimer's, for instance. That's something that hasn't happened yet to my knowledge, but it's something that bioethicists say probably will happen. Some say that probably will happen. People worry about that information coming out by way of a hack or a breach. They worry about a company being purchased by another company, and then that company doing something different because that company could unilaterally change their privacy and consent policies. So these are all questions of like, that are hard to answer because we don't know what the future is. And because this information is so valuable and at the same time so incredibly private, a lot of people are watching it very, very carefully.
Yeah, and I think kind of where we're first seeing that boundary being tested maybe is in this idea of solving crimes, right? We recently, even locally, right, the Golden State Killer was found through these large DNA databases. And we now are kind of at this conversation where, well, it seems okay to let them do that, but how much should that curtain be opened? What if you start using this to find people for smaller crimes or more contentious? I think, the book club was talking about recent BLM protests and, the police trying to really identify protesters. And so maybe before we get to this audience Q&A, we can kind of maybe end this facilitated discussion talking about, right, where we feel that line could be, or do we have the power to set that line somewhere, or just a full yes or no?
Yeah, so this field, which is known as investigative genetic genealogy, grew out the intersection between genetic genealogists who had figured out how to use certain techniques to help, for instance, adoptees find their birth families, in partnership with law enforcement. And it grew in the absence of any regulation. And to this day, something like 200 cases have been solved, or substantially assisted, let's say, by consumer databases. So places where people, donated their spit because they were sort of curious to find out, if they could contact that long lost first cousin. Those are the databases where this is happening. And that is a really good question, like to this point, that investigative genetic genealogy has primarily been used by the most heinous crimes, murders and sexual assaults for the most part, mostly cold cases. And that's partly because it's expensive to do this kind of work. And it's partly because I think law enforcement made the strategic decision, and the FBI, who's been pushing this in particular, that, they would get the greatest kind of public opinion on their side if they chose the worst of the worst, which makes a lot of sense. And the polling suggests that most Americans think that this is fine for heinous crimes. But as you say, there's a strong slippery slope argument to be made. There have been cases where, for instance, abandoned babies who died as a result of their abandonment have been identified through DNA testing. And then after that, the mothers who abandoned them arrested as a result of this use of investigative genetic genealogy. And there are people who say, well, that takes it too far, right? Because women who abandon their babies shortly after birth, there's often a really strong mental health component. So should we be criminalizing these women, through this technique, right? And so that's one of the big debates. And there have been other kinds of cases where it's like not exactly, murder, sexual assault, something a little bit lesser. And so the question is there going to be regulation, right? Is at some point someone going to step in, and instead of having every law enforcement agency that wants to use this however they want and potentially in a different way, is there someone who's going to step in and say like, no, this is like, let's do this the same way we've long regulated the use of, law enforcement databases back before we had consumer databases, and create rules for engagement and for access. And that hasn't happened yet. So that's something I'm really curious to see if it happens.
I think it'll.
All right, Libby, Thank you so much. Madison, thank you. This has been an excellent author talk, and we're going to take questions from the audience right now. So Carol asks, can you speak to the ownership of 23andMe and what they get from DNA collected, from DNA data collected?
Yeah, so the ownership is private at the moment. It's going to be going public through a partnership with a company that was founded by Richard Branson of Virgin America fame. And it was co-founded by Anne Wojcicki. And the question of where they what they do, how do they, what they get from this information they're collecting. The idea is essentially to speed up the process of scientific discovery for health related, human health related problems. So the idea is, if you could, I think Anne Wojcicki has called it, this idea is that she's going to solve health. She's used that phrase, solve health. The idea is that if you were in a lab at a university and you were trying to do research, you might have a hard time recruiting 100 subjects, right? Well, 23andMe has a database of over 10 million people. And 80% of them have opted into having their DNA be used for this research. So they have an absolute, abundance of people that they can study. And they're regularly sending out surveys to customers and asking them all sorts of questions. So if you have tested a 23andMe and you want to be, asked, and you're okay with your DNA being used this way, you might get lots of surveys every week or month saying, asking you about your, skin conditions or your family history of, heart disease. And they're taking that data and they're putting it together with the genetic information that they're parsing. And it's that combination of the genotypic and the phenotypic. Phenotypic is the, stuff that you're filling out, the way that your genes are expressing themselves, right? That is incredibly valuable. That is incredibly valuable information. It's not just one or the other, it's both together that makes it so valuable. And then they can either do drug research in-house, or they can partner with a company like GlaxoSmithKline in a tremendous deal that's worth, I think, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they can try to speed up the process of drug discovery. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Thank you so much. So Stacy asks, do people usually do more than one brand or type of test?
So I think most casual consumers don't, because it's expensive and they're not that committed. They might be able to test at the biggest company, which is at this moment Ancestry. It has the biggest database, and get a lot of their questions answered that way. But sometimes people are looking for something very specific, or they're looking to compare their experience, or they're writing a book, so they decide to test it more than one place, right? And so that you do see that happen. And sometimes people might do that because they're particularly looking for one specific person who's going to unlock the key of their own identity. One very, very close cousin, for instance. If you are an adopted person who is looking for your birth mother, trying to figure that out from, say, third cousins in a relatively small database is super challenging. You might be able to test at another company and get lucky and find a half sister, an aunt. And that's going to make, even a first cousin, that's going to make the job much quicker. You don't have to do as much painstaking genealogy going back in time. So sometimes people who are looking to answer a very specific question will test in more than one place, or if they're just kind of like genealogy obsessives, which is a growing cohort of Americans. And one of the things that I loved kind of writing about when I was writing Lost Family was like this kind of, I love subcultures of obsessives. I just think they're so awesome. I love when people get totally into something and I want to hear all about what their lives are like. And so genealogical obsessives, for lack of a better phrase, which is a lot of us right now, and I count myself among them, often will test in more than one place as well, because they're looking for, to do very specific kinds of research.
During our book club discussion, we talked about different countries and how they have their own version of 23andMe too, which is really interesting. So if you look at the chat, there's a rather detailed question that, Libby, you can scroll through. Essentially, the question concerns adoption, and
I can read it out loud if that's okay. Would that work? Okay.
Sure.
Says, my husband is adopted and I recently found his birth family aunt. I also found a birth brother whom the aunt said she is not going to tell about our contacting her. Got it. I'm concerned I may have genetic information that could influence his health and vice versa. I've only had 2 conversations with the aunt and want to stay friendly to help my own kids with their health and heritage. Is there an agency or some other identity that can help gauge this gap other than genetic testing? We have not done any genetic testing. So interesting. So it sounds like it's not clear to me whether you're wondering about, oh, I see. So you want to basically take a test because you're unable to connect with your husband's genetic brother and exchange health related information. And then you're wondering, like, is there some other way to get that information since you can't make contact with the brother and you don't want to take a test? I'm not sure. You're not going to find your genetic information if that's what you're looking for without taking a test. But you could, in theory, go through genetic testing in the context of a doctor's office, right? And then there's much more privacy protections. So, but typically that only happens, and insurance only pays for it, by the way, if you have a specific reason to need to test. So there's a bit of a catch-22. What you see happening in this world is someone takes a 23andMe test. They find out something surprising or something that troubles them, and then they go to their doctor, and their doctor might, on the strength of those results, order like an actual diagnostic test, because 23andMe tests are not considered diagnostic. They're basically considered entertainment. So, that is a kind of a good question. Is, could you theoretically, if you had a very specific question and a reason for wondering, could you go to your doctor and have that doctor order a test for you? You could, in theory. There's also companies like Color. There are a lot of other companies similar to them that offer medical testing that can give you like a risk profile for cancer, for instance. But you're not going to be entered into a database. You're not going to be matched to cousins. And that might be what you want. And you do need a doctor to greenlight that for you, but they often work with physicians networks to get you the prescription that allows you to take that test. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. Our next question from Van Moore: if you get different results about your ethnic or geographic origin from different companies, how do you know which one is valid? Can they be different and still valid?
So ethnicity estimates are estimates based on two key factors that vary from company to company. One is the reference populations that they're using to stand in for all of Norway, let's say, and every other place, right? So they've got a pool of people with deep roots in a particular area standing in for every population that they're purporting to be able to tell you about. And each company's got a different group of people, and one company might have a lot more people than another, right? 1,000 in a reference population is going to tell you a heck of a lot more on a granular level about the genetic variation in Norway than a company that's using a reference population with only 25 people from Norway. So that's one thing. And the other is that each company is using a different algorithm to parse the data. So they're making educated guesses based on their knowledge about what the genetic structure of a particular population looks like, right? But populations are pretty similar. As I said earlier, we are vastly genetically identical, 99.5% genetically identical. And there are not little flags on your genome that announce themselves as Korean, as Norwegian. And so a lot of this is interpretation, looking at DNA that looks very, very similar to other DNA. And that means that they can't always tell. So they do tend to get better, and they'll release these updates every 6 months or so. Your results improve. Suddenly something that you supposedly had disappears. It turns out it was background noise. And yes, I think in general, some companies are better at predicting certain populations than others, but that changes constantly and kind of depends on the population that you're looking at. So the best I can tell you is, test with one of the 4 major companies, not one of these other much smaller companies that can have, that are not as well vetted and are probably not as, and sometimes don't have as reliable results. One of the 4 companies would be like, say, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, or Family Tree DNA. You may have reasons for choosing one over another. There are lots of privacy concerns depending on who you go with. And that can be a subject for further research. But if you go with one of those 4 major companies, you're probably going to get, they're using the same basic approach, but they're just using it in a different way. And look into those companies, and maybe you can make a decision that way.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a few questions in our Q&A, so we'll answer those 2 more audience questions and then wrap things up. Jim asks, how much concern is there that a person could obtain fake DNA results in order to claim false affinity to a prospective victim for the purpose of obtaining financial support?
Fake DNA. Hang on, I want to look at that.
That's in the Q&A box at the...
Person could have fake DNA results in order to claim false affinity to a prospective victim for the purposes of obtaining financial support. I haven't heard of cases like that happening. I do think that there are chain of custody issues that make certain things possible that in an ideal world would not be possible. But again, I haven't heard of something like that happening. So, the way that these tests generally work is that at least at the 2 biggest companies, Ancestry and 23andMe, you actually have to spit into the vial and then send it in. So, you've got to get someone's saliva, usually. There are ways to kind of what's called spoof a kit, and I write about that in the book. It's a little bit more obscure and probably, a subject for another discussion. But for the most part, this is, stuff that is, you're actually spitting into the vial. On the other hand, the chain of custody is not really robust, right? So you do see situations where, for instance, like parents are testing their children, their infant children, for instance, or their young children who can't possibly be said to be giving consent. I suppose the parents could be saying, they're giving consent for them, but there are all sorts of kind of problems with DNA testing your child. It's not just this kind of like, you're not going to get, it's not HIPAA protected the way it would be in the context of a doctor's office. It's not carefully watched as, it goes from, your hands into the box, into the company. The companies are pretty good at tracking. They don't tend to like, swap vials and things like that. You hear people thinking that maybe that happened and explains their results. That almost never happens. But to answer your direct question, I don't know of any cases where that's happened.
Right, thank you. And then Nicole says, wonderful program. She's a librarian as well and recently used a home kit to solve my mother's adoption from 1954. Real quick question. Would there be any leads on researching First Nation ancestors? Her great-great-grandmother was Iroquois.
So sometimes I get that question, and I like to refer to people who are more expert in genetic genealogy, because I'm a journalist, so I sort of feel like I shouldn't be giving any kind of genetic genealogy advice. There's a good blog that you should check out. It's called Roots and Recombinant DNA. I'll say that again, Roots and Recombinant DNA. It's written by a genetic genealogist named T.L. Dixon, and he specializes in African American and Native American DNA testing. And he's got some good, writing and reporting there. And there's another website that is really good. It's by Roberta Estes. It's called Your DNA Explained. And she also is expert in Native American DNA. And so you can kind of read up on that topic there.
Thank you. Libby, thank you so much. And Madison, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for moderating the Q&A. And Libby, thanks for sticking around for a few extra minutes to round out some audience questions. I was wondering maybe, if you'll spare one more minute, if you can, as we wrap this up, kind of end with your thoughts of what did you find was the most intriguing while you did this, or that you connected with everyone, most about while doing these interviews, and what came across really strongly to you while writing this book? Yeah,
I think my kind of favorite story is the story that's like the heart of the book. And it's a story of a woman named Alice, and she takes a DNA test back in 2012. She gets surprising results. She kind of pulls her entire family into this journey, right? I mentioned her earlier. They have 7 Irish cousins, 7 Irish Catholic siblings in this family. They think they're entirely Irish and British Isles. She takes the test and she finds out she's half Ashkenazi Jewish. And she thinks, how can that be? We know her story. And they start to investigate. And what's awesome about Alice's story is it's very unexpected, right? She's able to confirm that it's none of the most expected explanations. So it's not that she's the product of a non-paternity event or adopted or donor conceived, or she is not like Rosario and coming from a population of people who hid their, their genetic ancestry. She's none of those things. But the kind of power and privilege of Alice's story and getting to write it was that her story went back 100 years. And I think, to be able to go back and do historical research going back a century to understand the beginnings of her genetic mystery was absolutely astonishing for me. And what it brought home is that the past isn't over. It's sitting curled inside our cells. And we happen to be living in this moment when you can cheaply and easily crack those cells open and discover, the past that's etched inside of them. That is absolutely astonishing, right? And that the past has the power to change us even as we don't know it, right? It's kind of like this this kind of presence in our present day lives. And the era of home DNA testing has now made it possible for us to understand all the ways that the past was shaping us even when we didn't know it. So I think that's the story that resonated with me. It's as I've done my own genealogy, it's something that I think about all the time as I've connected with long lost relatives and made trips to Europe to meet them, which is really amazing. And I write about that a little in the book. Is this kind of like this moment that we're in? There's promise in it, there's peril in it. But I think it's an absolutely astonishing moment for us to sort of consider.
All right. Thank you so much, Libby and Madison. That was Libby Copeland, interviewed by Madison Lehmer. And Libby was talking about her new book, The Lost Family, How DNA is Upending Who We Are. And I know Libby is joining us from the East Coast tonight. It's much later over there. Libby, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and best wishes as your book is getting read and published and everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.